Today's scripture comes from Matthew chapter 2, 13 through 18. Now, after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." The massacre of the infants. When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more.
Well, I've been told by a couple of people that we have a long service this morning, so I guess that means I shouldn't preach for too long. I'm not going to promise that this will be a succinct sermon, but it won't be what did we used to call those? A barnstorming sermon, right? As I was reading our text for the morning, I got to thinking about Ancestry.com and 23andMe. Thinking about how these services have been to people who come from, a boon to people who come from communities inconsequential to the telling of history, at least as is most often done. Peoples whose ancestors have largely lived on by the transmission of genetic material more than any rich cultural legacy. So while I was thinking about it, and I was thinking to myself, while we may feel the urgency of this unknowing acutely in particular moments in history, like one when people are recovering their communal histories that have been erased, and I thought about certainly my own situation as an African American, growing up at a time in which the history of my community was not explicitly suppressed, when it was actually celebrated, and being able during that time to find tenuous threads that went through the broken history of the transatlantic slave trade and ruptured families that it left in its wake. So there was a particular moment in time that I could feel the acuteness of this. But I was also reminded that, truth be told, this experience of the stories and legacies of marginalized and oppressed communities being lost to the sands of time is more often than not the reality of simply what it means to be human. This is especially true in situations in which state power is used to erase or to blot out the legacies and stories. Here in America, we often talk about the ways in which the indigenous peoples who were here for tens of thousands of years, how their stories sought to be blotted out by the new people who wanted to remythologize this land so that they might be able to claim it as their own. So at least for me, it is noteworthy when such stories are saved and transmitted across generations, particularly when they are kept without explanation. And that's an important part, kept without explanation. When they are kept because there is something important about them and their retelling, yet we're not given the key to understand what is exactly the one way to read these stories in order to get their meaning. The story of the wise men, the flight to Egypt, and the slaughter of the innocents is such a story. And it is such a case. To rehearse it, because some of you may not know the telling of the whole story, I was reminded of that. In fact, I put up a Facebook post about that. And you know, things become real when you put them on Facebook if you're a person of my age. That's when things become real. But what I put up was that too often, I think preachers and people who tell and find themselves in the pulpit or feel like they're talking to people who grew up with these stories and just know them front and back. And that's just not true nowadays. It's not true that everyone knows the story, that everyone has learned the story. So indulge me if you're one of the people who do know the story and who has heard the story, because I'm going to tell the story again for those of us who are prone to forget if we don't tell it again and again. The 3 wise men had come in search of a new thing God was doing. In the Roman province of Judea, they came to the local warlord or administrator, whatever you want to call Herod, to seek help in finding the place over which a star beckoned them, in which God's revelation of this new thing was to be found. Now, Herod, a notoriously brutal and insecure warlord, gave them direction while setting in place a plan to kill the child when he was discovered. The 3 wise men, or better yet, religious leaders, because that's what they were in their time, made aware of Herod's plan in an act of civil disobedience, paid homage to the child, and then went another way home. Went a way home that did not include going to tell Herod where they had found the child. Now, upon learning of this, of the wise men's disobedience, Herod set his plan in motion, but instead of a targeted killing of a single child, he cast a wide net with the decree that all male children under the age of 2 in the region of Bethlehem would be put to the sword, and so it was. That's the story, that's the backdrop of our text for the morning. As the story is remembered and told, Joseph, the parental of Jesus, was warned of the upcoming atrocity and fled the lethal visitation of the state security forces on his town, migrating under the threat of death to Egypt, a place that, while yet under imperial Roman rule, was out of Herod's reach. Now, what I find fascinating is that this particular part of the story was kept as being a part of the story of the origin of our faith. Right? This is not one of those little castaway stories. This is a significant story that's at the center of the origin of our faith. I say this because stories of corrupt and evil rulers wiping out towns, villages, entire regions to blot out some new birth of hope are common in human history. Common in human history from the very beginning until the time in which we live now. So this is not something that's out of the ordinary, but what's unique is that it is at the center of the beginning of the telling of our faith. People being forced to migrate to save their children from certain destruction happens more often than not. This is just a part of human living. But what I want to bring your attention to is that it's at the heart of the story of our faith. So the presence of this story in the narration of the life of Christ, Emmanuel, God with us, in all too common human history, says that there is something important about its memory and retelling. So when we read the text, and we understand its importance, we would be looking for something like, every time you tell this story, remember. Every time you tell this story, do this. every time you tell this story, say this prayer. That's not what happens. The story is just told. There's something important, I think, about recalling a story about religious figures seeking truth, being invited to cooperate with civil authorities, and when finding the true consequence of that cooperation, choose disobedience instead. There's something important about remembering that part of the story. There's something important about us recalling the story of a corrupt and evil civil authority whose use of the power of the state to blot out the future of a community by erasing its children. We need to remember that story. There's something important about us remembering that likely the first memories that Jesus had were vague recollection of his parents in a forced migration to another land and living as strangers in that new land. It's important for us to remember that that's part of the origin of our Christian faith. It is important that we remember. Now, in our Bible study, every now and then, we ask the question, why the church kept a particular story. So we'll get about 40 minutes into the hour, and then the 20 minutes that we have left, we talk about, so why do you think the church kept this particular story? Why do you think it kept this particular text? Because it's good for us to remind ourselves that the Bible we have today is a text that took shape and form over many years. Most recently, during the Reformation, when several books sacred to the Roman Catholic faith were left out of the Protestant Bible. So what we have are texts that were consciously kept. So what we have are texts that people thought were important for us to remember. Now, I believe that it was under the power of the Spirit that these decisions were made. And while we will never know why all of the texts were kept, even Martin Luther had trouble understanding why you should want to keep the book of James. We may not know why they were kept, but we do know they were kept. And so for this story, it's important that we remember. Now, there's a particular type of biblical hermeneutics. I know some of you are just waiting for that 75-cent term. There's a particular kind of biblical hermeneutics or biblical interpretation that's called reader reception theory. And its basis is that a text is most properly made sense of in the context of its contemporary reader, because that's the one who brings its intention to life. We are the ones who bring the intentions of our forebears in keeping these stories to life. It's the basis that the text is made sense by us. The intent or the why of the text may never be known. I mean, I have my own theory about why the slaughter of the innocents is remembered, because there was an early group of Christians who lived in the area of Bethlehem, whose children were taken away from them, and they wanted the church to remember that they had lost their children. They wanted the church to remember the price that they had paid for being even in proximity to Jesus. So we may not know exactly what the intent was, but the value may simply be in the guidance that recollection brings. The guidance of a story about wise men who had come to see what it was that God was doing, and God was doing new in this world, who had come to see the birth of a new hope a new future for humanity, who had come to see God's shining forth, God's love for all of creation. And when they were invited to be co-opted by the powers of civil authority, they chose civil disobedience. It's important for us to remember that at the beginning of our faith is that the family of Jesus, the family of the one who would come to save us all, had to flee to a land in which they were strangers because the edicts of the civil authority sought his life. It's important for us to remember that wise men, the parents of Jesus, the one who brings God's love, have no obligation to cooperate with systems of evil and oppression. And for us to remember, this is not just some kind of social justice thing. This is not just some kind of liberal politics thing. It's at the core of the telling of our faith, is that when Jesus was born, when the wise men came, and when Herod sought his life, God delivered him by making him a stranger in a new land. So I'm not going to tell you what to do with that. I'm not going to tell you what you ought to take away from that. But what I am going to say is that the church has believed for more than 2,000 years that it was important that we remember that story, because there is something in that story for each of us who claim the faith of Christ today. Amen.